The glass hit the table so hard the vibration ran up my arm. Frank didn't look at me. He just muttered, low and sharp enough to cut through the warm July air on the porch. "So, you enjoyed humiliating me back there, Janet?" I froze with the napkin still between my fingers. Fireworks cracked in the backyard. Kids laughed. Someone opened a soda with that crisp snap. But under this dim porch light, with only my father standing a few feet away, every sound felt distant, swallowed. He stepped closer. The wood beneath him creaked in that old familiar way, the same way it did the night he yanked open my desk drawers without warning and dumped every paper on the floor to make sure I wasn't hiding anything. His pulse throbbed in his neck, just like when I was 17. "I answered a simple question," he continued, each word landing heavy. "You didn't need to spit out that little comment." A thin shiver ran up my spine, not fear, not anymore, but memory. Memory has a way of sneaking back into the bones. The room behind us buzzed with the 4th of July celebration, but here, it felt like the world had narrowed into a tight hallway with no windows. I steadied myself, one hand resting lightly on the porch door behind me. I had lived under that gaze through all of high school. I knew exactly what it meant. I also knew I wasn't the same girl he used to corner into silence. "I told the truth," I said quietly, keeping my chin level. "They asked you how much my school costs. You don't even know." A voice called my name from the yard, then faded. Frank's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Not quite anger, just that familiar blade-edge disappointment he wore whenever he felt anyone slip out of his control. "You should have protected your father's pride," he said. "A daughter with manners would know that." A gust of wind rattled the screen door and brushed my shoulder as if urging me forward, away, anywhere but here. I swallowed hard, feeling the old instinct to shrink. But I didn't move. Not this time. And for the first time in my life, the porch felt big enough for just one of us. The kitchen lights hit me first when I stepped back inside, bright, unforgiving, nothing like the porch where shadows could hide the way my breath faltered. Susan stood by the counter arranging leftover dessert, humming like nothing in this house had ever cracked. She glanced up when she saw me, her smile soft but a little too quick, as if she'd heard more than she should. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for a plate, letting the ceramic scrape lightly across the counter. That small sound steadied me. Behind her, Harold was still talking to a group of relatives, his voice carrying as he reenacted some joke from earlier. Chloe scrolled on her phone at the table, her hair falling forward like a curtain, untouched by the tension that had followed me in. Susan lowered her voice. "Your dad seems worked up." A muscle in my back tightened. I kept my eyes on the pie knife she slid toward me. "He usually is." She hesitated, as if deciding whether to ask what really happened. Instead, she offered a nervous, half laugh. "Harold didn't mean anything by his question, you know that. He just blurts things." I finally looked up. "He asked a simple question." I answered a simple question. Susan's smile wavered. "Frank doesn't like being surprised." "He doesn't like being contradicted," I corrected. The fridge door opened behind us with a dull thud. My cousin Anthony, one of those added bodies who always floated at family events, grabbed a can of soda and glanced between us. "Everything good?" Susan said yes before I could speak. He nodded and left, the can's tab snapping open as he walked away. Another small sound, another reminder that life moved normally for everyone else. Susan touched my arm, light, tentative. "Maybe just let him cool off a bit." I pulled in a slow breath. I've spent half my life letting him cool off. Someone called for group photos outside. Chairs scraped, a door slammed. The house shifted in a dozen tiny movements. But I stayed at the counter, anchored by a truth I'd never said aloud. I wasn't afraid of him anymore, not the way I used to be. Still. The weight of his anger pressed at the edge of my thoughts, familiar as an old bruise. "Janet," Susan whispered, Don't make this bigger than it is. I almost laughed, quiet, without humor. He made it big years ago. Her eyes dropped, and for a moment she didn't have anything to say. Outside, someone yelled for everyone to hurry. I picked up 2 forks. The metal tapped lightly against each other as I lifted them. A tiny, accidental sound, but enough to steady me again. The backyard was crowded when I stepped outside again. Folding chairs lined the grass. Someone's Bluetooth speaker buzzed with static before settling into an old country song, and kids chased each other between the picnic tables. Chloe waved from across the yard, but I wasn't ready to join anyone yet. I moved toward the quieter side near the fence, hoping the evening air would clear the sting still sitting in my chest. I heard footsteps in the grass before I saw him. Harold approached with a drink in hand, ice clinking against the glass. "There you are. Got everyone wondering where you disappeared to." I managed a thin smile. Just needed a breather. He leaned on the fence beside me. "Listen, about earlier. Didn't think that question would cause a storm." "It wasn't your fault," I said. "You asked something anyone would have asked." He shrugged. Frank looked like he swallowed a lemon whole. I didn't respond. He noticed. "Janet," he added softer, "you okay?" A group behind us burst into laughter. Someone dropped a plastic cup. It bounced once on the deck before rolling off the edge. Little things, but each sound made the yard feel too loud, too bright. "I just told the truth," I said. "That's all." Harold took a sip of his drink. "Your dad's always been particular about appearances. That's one word for it." He exhaled a slow breath. "Susan tries to smooth things over, but you know how your father gets when he feels challenged." Another word for it, controlling. But Harold wasn't the enemy here. He didn't know the nights Frank slammed doors because a grade hadn't been updated online yet, or the mornings he emptied my backpack onto the kitchen table because he was checking for honesty, or the constant tension that lived in the walls whenever he paced behind me during homework. I rubbed my thumb along the wooden railing, grounding myself. He never asks how school is, never asked what classes I'm taking, but he's furious that people know he's not paying for it. Harold was quiet for a moment. He's proud, sometimes too proud. "Pride doesn't pay tuition," I muttered. He almost smiled at that. Almost. "If you ever need a hand, even just someone to vent to, you know Susan and I are here." I nodded, appreciating the offer, even if I wasn't sure how to accept kindness without feeling like it came with strings attached. From the patio, someone called out, "Family picture, everyone get over here." Harold straightened. "Think you can survive a few more minutes of Cole family chaos?" I drew in a steady breath. I've survived worse. But as we walked toward the group, a familiar tension tightened across my shoulders. Frank was already standing with the others, chin lifted, expression unreadable. My pulse stuttered, faint but undeniable. Old habits don't leave easily. I took my place beside Susan. She squeezed my hand briefly, an anchor in the noise. The camera clicked. Flash. Another click. Frank didn't look at me once, but I felt his silence like a finger pressed against an old bruise. And just like that, something inside me shifted. Small, sharp, the kind of realization you don't say yet but can't unhear once it settles. When the pictures were done, people scattered again. Some back to the food, some toward the fireworks, others drifting into those small family clusters that form naturally at gatherings. I slipped away toward the side of the house, needing distance before Frank decided to corner me again. I didn't make it far. His voice cut through the chatter. "Janet." I stopped, not because I wanted to, but because my body still responds to that tone the way it did when I was 16. I turned slowly. He was already walking toward me, his steps quick, controlled, carrying that familiar edge of impatience. "Come here," he said. I didn't move. "I can hear you just fine." His jaw tightened. "We're not doing this in front of people." You approached me, I reminded him. He stepped closer, the heel of his shoe grinding a small pebble into the concrete. A sharp crack echoed between us, too loud for something so small. You need to fix what you said earlier. I blinked once. Fix the truth? That wasn't your place. His eyes were cold, steady. You had no right to embarrass me like that. Embarrass. Always that word. Never the nights he made me cry over a B+. Never the hours he spent lecturing me about discipline while pacing the length of my room. But this, me refusing to play along with his image, this was humiliation. He lowered his voice further. You will tell your uncle you misspoke. No, I said, soft but firm. His nostrils flared. Don't talk back. I'm not talking back, I replied. I'm telling you no. For a moment, everything in his face stilled, the kind of stillness that comes right before he used to explode when I was younger. I felt the shadow of that history hovering near my skin, but it didn't land the same way anymore. You think paying for school yourself makes you grown? He asked. You're still my daughter. And that's why I should lie for you? He stared at me as if I'd said something obscene. I folded my arms, grounding myself. They asked you how much my tuition costs. You don't know. How is that my fault? His fingers curled slightly at his sides. You made me look weak. There's a difference between looking weak and being caught off guard, I said. His voice sharpened. You will fix it. I shook my head. I won't. A long silence stretched between us. Someone inside dropped a serving spoon. The clatter rang out and a few people laughed. The world kept moving. He stepped even closer, enough that I could smell the faint mix of aftershave and anger. I'm warning you, Janet. That old familiar pressure tightened in my chest, but alongside it came something new, something steadier. I met his eyes. I'm not 17 anymore. His stare flickered, just for a second, but I saw it, the brief slip where he realized he couldn't yank the strings the way he used to. And that was its own kind of shift, sharp, quiet, a fracture under the surface. He turned first, muttering something under his breath as he walked back toward the yard. I exhaled slowly, my hand brushing the brick wall beside me to steady the tremor that still wanted to rise. Not fear, not exactly, more like the ghost of fear. But ghosts don't get to drive anymore. I slipped back into the house before anyone noticed me missing. The living room was quieter now. Just a handful of relatives watching the televised fireworks, the screen flashing red and blue across their faces. I moved toward the hallway, hoping for a moment alone, but Chloe intercepted me near the stairwell. Aunt Janet, she said softly, tucking her phone into her pocket, can I ask you something? Her expression was different from earlier. No teenage indifference, no distraction, just concern. It caught me off guard. Sure, I said. She shifted her weight, fingers brushing the railing. Did I hear right? That you're paying for college yourself? I let out a slow breath. Yes. But why? Grandpa always talks like he set aside money for you. He did, I said, with conditions. She frowned. Like what? I hesitated, not wanting to drag her into something she didn't need to carry. But then she added, he gives Chloe these talks about pressure and expectations too. Not like your dad, but enough that she gets anxious sometimes. That made something tighten in my chest. A recognition, a warning, a past reaching into the present. He used college as leverage, I said. Grades, classes, weekly check-ins, surveillance, sometimes. I tapped the stair rail lightly with my knuckle. It wasn't support, it was control. Chloe's eyes widened a little. That sounds exhausting. It was, I said. I didn't want to live like that in college, too. She looked toward the porch window where her dad and Frank stood talking again, their silhouettes sharp against the outdoor lights. He's mad because you told the truth? Yes, she swallowed, her voice dropping. He scares me sometimes. That admission hit harder than any accusation Frank had thrown at me. I reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. You don't have to let him shape who you become. Footsteps echoed from the kitchen. Someone called her name. She squeezed my hand quickly before stepping back. Thanks, she whispered. I watched her go, a quiet ache settling behind my ribs. Maybe the damage wasn't contained to my generation after all. I stayed in the hallway after Chloe left, letting the murmur of voices drift around me. The house felt smaller than it used to. Narrow walls, low ceilings, the kind of space where tension settles like dust. I pressed my palm lightly against the wallpaper, grounding myself before stepping toward the dining room. The table was half cleared now, paper plates stacked, a serving bowl pushed to the side, and at the far end sat Frank, alone, elbows on the table, fingers interlaced like he was holding back a storm. He didn't look up when I walked in, but his jaw tightened. Sit. I didn't. If you want to talk, we can talk, but I'm not going to be summoned. His eyes lifted, slowly, deliberately. You think you're above respect now? I think respect goes both ways, I said. He shoved his chair back with a harsh scrape across the floor. A couple of relatives glanced over before quickly looking away. Frank lowered his voice. You're going to fix what you said. Tonight. No, I replied. I'm not lying for you. His nostrils flared. You made me look like I abandoned you. You didn't abandon me, I said evenly. You tried to control me. His knuckles whitened. You always exaggerate. A sharp memory flashed, him yanking my locker open without permission, papers spilling over the concrete. His voice that day. If you're hiding something, I'll find it. The sting in my chest then was the same shape as the one rising now. I'm not exaggerating, I said. You made my entire teenage life about fear of disappointing you. Someone dropped a fork in the kitchen. Small clatter, too loud in the stillness. He leaned forward. You're twisting history. You're rewriting it, I answered. For the first time, his expression faltered. Just a flicker, but I saw it. The brief uncertainty. The part of him that knew I wasn't a child anymore. Then he stood. Quick, abrupt. His chair tipped slightly before he caught it. I'm done with this, he muttered. So am I. He froze for half a breath, not expecting that. A door swung open behind us and Susan stepped in holding a tray. She paused, reading the tension instantly. Everything all right in here? Frank straightened. We're fine. I didn't correct him. Not out of fear, out of refusal to play the same game. He brushed past Susan, leaving the dining room with steps too heavy to be casual. She turned to me, worry creasing her forehead. Janet, what did he say? I picked up a loose napkin from the table, smoothing the corner with my thumb. Nothing I haven't heard before. She touched my arm. You don't deserve this. The napkin crumpled slightly under my fingers. I know. But knowing and healing are never the same moment. The night air hit me as soon as I stepped outside again, cooler now, carrying the distant echo of fireworks from neighboring streets. I walked toward the far end of the yard where the lights didn't reach, needing the quiet more than anything. My steps brushed through the grass, each movement loosening the tightness in my chest. I didn't hear him approach at first. It was the soft crunch of gravel behind me that gave him away. Janet. Not my father this time. Harold. I turned slightly but didn't move closer. The moonlight caught the edge of his glasses as he stopped a few feet away. You disappeared again, he said. Just needed space. He nodded, hands in his pockets. Frank looks rattled. A humorless breath escaped me. He's angry he can't control the story. Harold shifted his weight. He told me he feels judged. He feels exposed, I corrected. He studied my face for a moment, careful, thoughtful. Did he say something to you? I hesitated, not because I wanted to protect Frank, but because I didn't want to reopen wounds that were already bleeding beneath the surface. Same things he always says. I embarrassed him. I shouldn't have contradicted him. That kind of thing. Harold exhaled through his nose, slow and frustrated. He's stuck in his ways. Been that way forever. It's not just stubbornness, I said, my fingers brushing a low branch above me. It's ownership. He wants the version of me that keeps him comfortable. And that's not who you are anymore, he said. No, I whispered. It's not. A burst of laughter drifted from the patio. The contrast felt sharp. Two worlds only a few feet apart. Harold moved a little closer, but not invading. I hope you know you didn't do anything wrong tonight. I know, I said, but the truth was heavier. Doesn't mean it didn't hurt. He looked down for a moment, kicking lightly at a loose stone. Susan worries about you. I know she does. She said she noticed something off in your eyes during pictures. I let out a breath. Old habits, I said. Old fears. They show up sometimes. Does the fear still come from him? He asked quietly. I answered with silence, because silence is its own truth. A few seconds later, he touched my elbow gently. You're stronger than anything he tries to pull. Anyone who's watched you these last few years can see that. The kindness stung more than the confrontation earlier. I swallowed hard to steady the sharpness rising in my throat. Thank you, I murmured. We stood there for another moment, the glow of the house behind us, the soft hum of crickets around us. Then he stepped back, giving me space again. Come join us when you're ready, he said. I will. When he left, I stayed beneath the tree, listening to the faint rustle of leaves, soft, steady, unaffected by the chaos of human pride. For the first time that night, my shoulders lowered, not in defeat, in release. I finally walked back toward the house when the noise settled into a gentler murmur. No shouting, no sharp footsteps, just the thrum of conversation and the soft hiss of sparklers outside. The sliding door stuck for a second as I pulled it open, the frame catching before giving way with a dull click. Inside, most people had gathered near the fireplace where someone had started a late-night movie. Only one person wasn't blending into the crowd. Frank stood by the kitchen island, arms crossed, staring at his phone like it had personally offended him. His eyes lifted the moment he sensed movement. Mine. I tried to turn toward the living room instead, but he spoke before I took 2 steps. We're not done. I stopped, shoulders tightening. I'm not having another scene. This isn't a scene, he said. This is a father trying to make sure his child doesn't disrespect him. I let out a quiet breath. Frank, I'm 52. I am not a child. He set his phone down, hard enough that it rattled against the granite. A couple of relatives glanced over. He lowered his voice, but the edge was unmistakable. You need to understand something. When you correct me in front of people, you undermine me. People think I failed as a father. That's not my responsibility, I said, and I didn't correct you. I told the truth. You shouldn't have said anything. They asked you about tuition, I replied. You don't know the amount. That's not my fault. His breath hitched in irritation. You could have kept quiet. I kept quiet for years. He took a step closer. The refrigerator hummed behind him, a low vibration filling the space. You made it sound like I refused to pay for you. I looked him straight in the eyes. You made it impossible for me to accept your money. His jaw flexed. You're making me the villain. You made yourself the villain, I said softly. For a moment, everything froze. The chatter from the living room, the clink of dishes, even the shifting shadows on the floor. He stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. Then he whispered, You're ungrateful. I didn't flinch, but something inside me compressed, not in fear, in recognition, because I had waited my entire youth for him to say those words out loud, words he'd implied 100 times without speaking. I steadied my breath. I'm not ungrateful, I'm free. His face twisted, not in anger this time, but in something he didn't want seen. He snatched his phone and turned away, gripping the countertop so tightly his knuckles went pale. Susan appeared in the doorway, her expression tense as she took in the scene. "Everything all right?" Frank answered for us. "Fine." I didn't echo it. I didn't pretend. Instead, I stepped past him, the soft pad of my footsteps on the tile carrying me into the living room where the glow of the TV washed over everyone else. A few cousins smiled, shifting to make room for me on the couch. But I didn't sit. I just stood there, realizing the shift wasn't just between him and me. It was inside me. Something old had cracked, and something steadier was taking its place. I slipped into the far corner of the living room where the lamp cast a soft halo across the carpet. Kids were sprawled on pillows, half watching the movie and half falling asleep. Adults murmured in low voices. The hum of the dishwasher filled the gaps. Everything looked peaceful, almost tender, yet I felt like I was standing on the edge of a quiet cliff. Chloe approached me again, this time slower, as if sensing the air around me had shifted. She held a paper cup of lemonade, condensation dripping onto her wrist. "Aunt Janet," she whispered. "Did he yell at you?" I shook my head. "Not exactly." "That's worse," she said under her breath, "when he gets quiet like that." Her observation cut deeper than she knew. I lowered myself onto the arm of a chair, keeping my posture steady. "You don't need to worry about me." She lifted her shoulders. "I kind of do." A few feet away, Harold pretended to watch the TV, though his eyes flicked toward us every few seconds. Susan hovered near the kitchen doorway, biting her lip, torn between stepping in and giving space. Everyone felt the tension, even if they pretended otherwise. Chloe leaned closer. "Can I ask something? Real question?" "Yes," she swallowed. "Did you ever feel like, no matter what you did, it wasn't enough for him?" The memory hit like a dull, familiar weight. Nights spent rewriting essays until dawn, not because they were bad, but because Frank had said, "You should do better than this. I expect excellence." Or the way he would inspect my homework with the intensity of a detective, as if a stray eraser mark meant I was hiding something. "Yes," I said softly, "every day." Her voice cracked a little. "I'm starting to feel that way." My stomach tightened. "Has he said something?" "Not exactly." She looked down at her cup. "He told me last month that I needed to prove I deserved the money they're spending. And he said it like if I mess up once, he'll hold it over my head forever." I placed a hand on her forearm. "You don't owe him perfection." She blinked hard. "But he looks at me like I'm already disappointing him, and I haven't even done anything yet." A sparkler fizzled outside, its soft hiss drifting through the open window. Chloe's shoulders curled inward. "I don't want to end up afraid to breathe wrong," she whispered. I squeezed her arm gently. "You won't. Not if you see the signs early." She nodded, but her eyes glistened. Then a sharp voice cut across the room. "Chloe." "Frank." She stiffened instantly, like a string pulled too tight. He stood near the hallway with his arms crossed, gaze fixed on her. "Come here." The command hung in the air. Familiar and heavy. Chloe set down her lemonade, hands trembling. "You don't have to jump every time he calls," I whispered. But she was already moving, taught by years of watching him command a room with nothing but disapproval. As she passed me, our eyes met, and I saw it, clear as daylight. It wasn't just my story anymore. The pattern lived on, and that realization slid into me like a cold blade. Chloe followed Frank toward the dining room, her steps small, shoulders tight. I stayed in the living room doorway, close enough to hear, but far enough that he wouldn't accuse me of interfering. The murmur of the TV filled the background, but my focus stayed locked on the low tension drifting from the next room. Frank's voice came first, measured, but edged. "You shouldn't be wandering off during family time." Chloe kept her head lowered. "I wasn't wandering. I was talking to Aunt Janet." "That's exactly what I mean," he said. "You're getting distracted." A sharp pressure tightened behind my ribs. I moved closer, staying behind the corner so he wouldn't see me yet. I wasn't distracted, Chloe murmured. I was just... Frank cut her off. You need to act like someone who understands the investment being made in you. I felt my breath hitch, the weight of old words echoing through his tone. Investment, expectation, performance. The same vocabulary he had used on me for years, polished just enough to sound reasonable to outsiders. Chloe's fingers twisted together. I am trying. Trying isn't enough, he said. That was the line. The exact line he used to throw at me across kitchen tables and study desks, spilling from his mouth like scripture. My chest tightened. Not with fear, but with something sharper, something closer to finality. I stepped forward before I could talk myself out of it. Frank. He turned, startled, annoyed. Chloe looked relieved, which told me everything I needed to know. He straightened his shoulders. We're having a private conversation. No, I said calmly. You're having a performance. His brows drew together. Excuse me? You're using the same lines you used on me, I said, stepping into the room fully now. Word for word. Chloe's eyes widened. Frank's jaw tightened. This isn't about you. Exactly, I said. So stop dragging your fear into her life. His voice rose half an inch. Fear? You're afraid of looking like a failure, I said, and instead of dealing with that, you turn the people around you into projects. His face flushed a deeper shade. But I continued before he could cut me off. You used pressure as parenting, surveillance as structure, control as love, and now you're doing it to her. Chloe let out a small, shaky breath. Frank pointed at me sharply. You don't get to undermine me in front of family. That's the problem, I said. Your pride keeps outrunning your responsibility. He stepped closer, hand twitching like he wanted to grab the back of a chair to anchor himself. You're speaking out of bitterness. No, I said. I'm speaking out of recognition. The dining room fell silent except for the faint tick of the wall clock. Chloe, Frank said, ignoring me now. Go outside. She hesitated, eyes darting between us. Grandpa, Now. She turned, but I touched her arm lightly. You don't have to go. Frank stiffened. Yes, she does. Chloe swallowed. Aunt Janet. I held her gaze. You're not wrong for wanting to breathe. Something broke in her expression. Something small, fragile, real. Frank's voice dropped to a growl. You're crossing a line. No, I said, steady. The line was crossed years ago. I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't happen. His eyes flashed. You're poisoning her against me. I'm giving her the words I wish someone had given me. Footsteps sounded behind us. Harold moving fast, reading the tension instantly. Is everything all right? Frank turned to him. Your niece is interfering in my family. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Your family includes her, and she's not a vessel for your ego. Harold stepped beside Chloe protectively. The gesture was subtle, but powerful. Frank stared at the three of us, me, Chloe, Harold, and for the first time all night, I saw something flicker behind his anger. Not fear, not guilt, but the realization that control only works when everyone agrees to be small. And none of us were small anymore. Frank's stare hardened, the kind of stare that once froze my entire world when I was a teenager. But now, it only deepened the stillness in me, the kind that doesn't come from fear, but from certainty. He stepped forward, shoulders squared. Janet, you need to stop this. You're creating a problem where there isn't one. There is a problem, I said. You just don't like that someone finally named it. His nostrils flared. You think you're helping her? I know I am. He scoffed, loud enough that a few relatives turned their heads. This is why I set boundaries with you growing up. You were always dramatic. The word hit like a familiar blade, but it didn't cut the way it used to. Instead, it sharpened something inside me. Frank, I said, You searched my backpack in front of the neighbors because a grade showed as missing online. You slammed my locker door so hard the hinge cracked. You called weekly grade meetings structure when they were surveillance. That wasn't boundary setting. That was fear disguised as authority. His face twitched. You're rewriting your childhood. Then why? I asked quietly. Does she recognize it? I turned slightly toward Chloe, who stood beside Harold, arms wrapped around herself. She nodded, tiny, trembling, but true. Frank opened his mouth, but no words came out. Harold stepped in then, voice steady. Frank, she's allowed to have opinions about her own life. And Chloe's allowed to feel what she feels. Frank rounded on him. This is family business. And she is family, Harold replied calmly. You don't get to isolate her. For a moment, the room seemed to pulse, like something long buried was shifting under the floorboards. Frank finally snapped, I'm done with this conversation. He moved to walk past me. I stepped aside, not yielding but choosing my space. As he passed, he muttered, Ungrateful, both of you. Chloe flinched like she'd been struck. I spoke before the silence swallowed her reaction. Gratitude is not obedience, Frank. He spun back toward me. You're twisting everything I say. No, I said. I'm hearing it clearly. We stared at each other. The air between us felt heavy, years of unspoken things pressing against the edges. Then something unexpected happened. Chloe's voice. Small but steady. Grandpa, I don't want to be afraid of you. Frank froze. Her words were barely above a whisper, but they carried more weight than anything I'd said all night. I just want to feel safe, she said, not like I'm failing before I start. He blinked. Once, twice. His expression cracked, not softened, not remorseful, just stunned, as if the idea that she had her own emotional world was new. He looked away. He looked away first. That was the shift. The tiniest fracture in his armor. Susan entered then, her face tight with concern as she read the room instantly. What's going on? No one answered. Frank brushed past all of us, muttering something unintelligible, disappearing down the hallway like a retreating storm. When he was gone, the entire space exhaled at once. Chloe's shoulders sagged. Harold rubbed a hand over his face. Susan touched her daughter's back, unsure whether to comfort or question. I stepped forward and placed a hand gently on Chloe's arm. You were brave. Her eyes glistened. I was scared. That's what makes it brave, I said. She leaned into me. Not a hug, just a small lean, weighted and real. I steadied her without thinking. Harold whispered, This has been coming for years. And I realized he was right. This wasn't a moment. This was a crack in a legacy I refused to pass down. The house felt heavier after Frank left the room, as if his absence carried its own weight. People moved more quietly. Conversations softened. Even the TV seemed to dim itself. I guided Chloe toward the living room sofa, letting her sit while I took the edge of the coffee table across from her. Her knees bounced. A nervous tremor she couldn't hide. You did the right thing, I said. She shook her head. I don't know, I feel like I broke something. No, I replied gently. You revealed something that was already broken. She looked down at her hands. He's going to be so mad. Susan sat beside her daughter, smoothing a hand over her arm. He'll have to deal with his own feelings. You don't owe him silence. But Susan's voice wavered, and Chloe noticed. You're scared of him too, Chloe whispered. Susan didn't answer. Her silence said enough. Harold remained standing, arms crossed, not defensive but protective. He looked like a man finally acknowledging a truth he'd ignored to keep the peace. I leaned forward. Chloe, listen to me. Fear taught me how to be quiet. It taught me how to disappear in the moments I needed strength most. It taught me that approval was something I had to earn. I paused, but none of that was love. She blinked hard, her pulse visible at her throat. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow, deliberate, Everyone tensed instinctively like a collective flinch embedded from years of conditioned silence. But it wasn't Frank. It was Anthony, holding 2 folded lawn chairs, eyes darting around the room. Should I put these outside? The tension cracked for a second. Susan nodded quickly. Yes, sweetheart, thank you. He slipped out, blissfully unaware. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence returned, dense, intimate. Chloe drew in a shaky breath. Aunt Janet, how did you get out? The question was a quiet lightning strike. Bright, searing, inevitable. I answered honestly. I didn't get out all at once. It was small things. Paying for school myself, talking back once and realizing the world didn't fall apart, moving out before he wanted me to, choosing who I became without asking him first. Chloe wiped a tear with her sleeve. I want that kind of strength. You already showed it, I said. Just now, in front of him. She shook her head. It didn't feel like strength. Strength rarely feels like strength when you're using it for the first time. Her breath caught, and she covered her mouth with her hand as another tear slipped out. Susan's eyes filled too, but she blinked them back. I should have said something sooner, she whispered. Harold stepped behind the sofa, placing a hand on her shoulder. His voice was quiet but firm. We all should have. I could feel the shift happening. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. The kind of shift that doesn't come with fireworks or shouting. The kind that comes when the truth finally has a place to stand. Then the back door opened again. Frank's figure appeared in the doorway, rigid, unreadable, framed by the porch light. Every muscle in Chloe's body locked. Susan stiffened. Harold's jaw set. And I, steady, grounded, unmoved, rose to my feet, because whatever came next would decide the shape of everything that followed. Frank didn't move at first. He stood framed in the doorway, shoulders squared, the porch light outlining the hardened lines of his face. The room reacted to him the way a body reacts to a cold wind, subtle, instinctive, impossible to hide. Chloe shrank into the sofa. Susan's hand froze mid-air. Harold's posture shifted just enough to place himself between his daughter and the man who had shaken the house without raising his voice. I stepped forward. Not aggressively, not timidly, simply present, in a way I had never allowed myself to be around him before. He closed the door behind him with a slow, deliberate click. We need to talk, he said. I didn't blink. Then talk. His eyes swept the room, clearly annoyed that he didn't have the privacy he was used to. Not here. Here is fine, I replied. His jaw flexed. Janet. No. My voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It simply landed. You're not going to isolate me. Or her. His gaze flicked toward Chloe, who immediately looked down, gripping a throw pillow like it was the only stable thing in the room. Frank took a step forward. The floorboard beneath him creaked, the same sound it used to make outside my childhood bedroom door when he'd pace during exam weeks, waiting for me to crack, waiting for me to apologize for an offense he hadn't named yet. I don't appreciate being spoken to like that, he said, especially by my own daughter. You don't appreciate being held accountable, I replied. He inhaled sharply. I did everything I could to provide for you. Providing isn't the same as parenting. The words dropped between us, quiet but heavy. His face tightened. You're twisting things again. No, I said. I'm remembering them correctly. He shook his head. You've always exaggerated. A small voice cut through the tension. Grandpa. She's not exaggerating. We all turned. Chloe wasn't standing, but her chin lifted a little, just enough. Frank stared at her, stunned. Excuse me? She swallowed, shoulders trembling. You talk to me the same way you talk to her. His brows shot up. I do not. Yes, she whispered. You do. Frank looked around the room as if searching for backup that wasn't coming. Susan's eyes were on the floor. Harold's expression was cold enough to hold steel. Frank's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet I remembered far too well. "You think I'm a monster now?" I stepped forward before the guilt he aimed at her could land. "Nobody said that." "You're all teaming up on me," he snapped. "We're telling the truth," I said. "Maybe for the first time." He turned toward me sharply. "You think you're helping her? Filling her head with nonsense?" I shook my head. "I'm giving her language for things she already feels." He opened his mouth, ready to unleash the kind of anger that once hollowed me out. But then something happened, something I had never seen in him before. His breath wavered, just a hair, just enough. And in that fractured second, I realized he wasn't just angry. He was terrified. Terrified that the power he spent decades shaping wasn't holding anymore. He masked it quickly, but the crack had already shown. His voice came quieter, rougher. "I did what I thought was right." "I know," I said, "but intention doesn't erase impact." He looked at me then, really looked. Not as a child to be corrected, not as a threat, but as someone who had finally stepped out of the old script he kept trying to hand me, and he didn't know what to do with that. A long silence followed, thick, unresolved. Then he muttered, "I need some air," and brushed past us. The front door opened, closed, gone. Not in anger this time, in retreat. Chloe let out a shaky breath, almost a sob. Susan reached for her. Harold exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. I stood there, feeling the house settle around us. Not calmer, not healed, but honest. For the first time all night. For the first time in years. The room slowly exhaled after the front door closed, like the walls had been holding a breath just as long as we had. Chloe wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. Susan wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, trying to be steady even though her own hands were trembling. Harold stood by the doorway, listening for any sign Frank might come storming back in. He didn't. Only the distant chirp of crickets and the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. I moved closer to Chloe. "You did nothing wrong." She sniffed. "It didn't feel like nothing." "That's how it feels the first time you speak a truth someone doesn't want to hear." Her eyes met mine, red but brave. "Are you scared?" I paused. "I'm not scared of him anymore. I'm aware of him. That's different." Harold stepped forward. "Frank's not used to people pushing back. He's built his whole life on being the authority in every room." I nodded. "He mistakes obedience for respect." "He always has," Susan whispered. The three of us fell quiet for a moment. Then a sudden crack echoed from outside, a firework someone set off too close to the driveway. The sound jolted everyone, especially Chloe. She flinched hard, sucking in a breath. Without thinking, I reached out and held her hand. "It's okay. It's just noise." She nodded, but her hand stayed tight in mine. Harold ran a hand through his hair. "I'm going to check that he didn't drive off upset." Susan touched his arm. "Be careful." He grabbed his keys and stepped out the front door, leaving it slightly ajar. The porch light cast a thin strip of glow into the living room. When he was gone, Susan sank onto the sofa. She looked exhausted, like she had been holding up 2 generations and finally set the weight down. "I should have stopped him sooner," she said quietly. "You were surviving him," I replied. "That's not the same as agreeing with him." She pressed her lips together. "He wasn't always like this, you know." I believed her. People rarely start out as the worst version of themselves, but somewhere along the line, Frank had confused control with care, and no one had the language or the courage to confront it until tonight. Chloe leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "I don't want to end up scared of him the way Aunt Janet was." "You won't," Susan said quickly. I met her eyes. "She needs consistency, not promises." Susan swallowed hard. "You're right." Chloe straightened a little, trying to steady herself. "What if he's mad forever?" "Then that's his choice," I said, "not your burden." Another soft burst of fireworks crackled in the distance. For the first time all night, the sound didn't make Chloe flinch. Harold returned a minute later, closing the door gently behind him. He's sitting in the driveway, not leaving, just talking to himself, I think. Susan let out a long breath. That's better than shouting. I nodded. He's realizing something he didn't expect to face. Which is? Harold asked. That fear doesn't work anymore. The room went still. Not heavy, not tense. Just still. Something had shifted. Not fully, not finally, but undeniably. Harold closed the curtains halfway, leaving a thin line of porch light stretching across the floor. He stayed near the window, watching the driveway like a man monitoring a wildfire he wasn't sure had burned out. The rest of us remained seated, tired, quiet, but holding on to the fragile calm that had settled in the room. Chloe shifted beside Susan, pulling her knees up onto the couch. Is he going to come back in angry? No, I said softly. Not tonight. She frowned. How do you know? Because anger needs an audience, and he doesn't have one anymore. Susan exhaled shakily. That's the truest thing I've heard all evening. The TV flickered with muted fireworks, their reflections dancing across the glass coffee table. Someone outside laughed, light-hearted, distant, completely detached from the storm unraveling inside this house. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. Chloe, listen to me. Her eyes lifted. Yeah? You didn't cause anything tonight. You revealed the truth of how you feel. That's not rebellion, that's honesty. She bit the inside of her cheek. I've never said anything like that to him before. I know, I said, but you needed to. And you did. Her voice cracked. I was shaking the whole time. I used to shake too, I said, until one day I realized the shaking didn't mean I was weak. It meant I'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. That made her swallow hard. Harold finally stepped away from the window. He's still sitting in the car, engine off, lights off, just thinking. Susan rubbed her forehead. Let him think. He might come inside later, Harold said. If he does, I replied, he'll come in differently. Chloe hugged a pillow to her chest. What if he tries to talk to me again? You don't have to talk alone, I said, not anymore. Harold nodded firmly. She won't. Susan took her daughter's hand. Neither of us will let you face that on your own. Something fragile shifted in Chloe's face, relief mixed with fear and something like hope. She wiped at the corner of her eyes. I stood then, stretching slightly, letting the ache of old wounds spread and settle without overpowering me. My reflection in the dark TV screen caught my eye. Older, steadier. No longer a girl waiting to be scolded. No longer someone he could bend. Chloe's voice came again, small but clear. Aunt Janet? Yes? What made you finally stop being scared of him? I paused. The room waited. My life got bigger than his anger, I said. Once that happens, they can't shrink you back. She breathed out slowly like the words landed somewhere deep. A sudden movement at the window made Harold stiffen. He's getting out of the car, he murmured. The room held its breath. Chloe's grip tightened around the pillow. Susan straightened. I stayed still, steadying myself for whatever shape this next moment would take. The front door handle clicked. Not loud, not aggressive, just inevitable. And I knew. Whatever happened next wouldn't be the same story repeating. It would be the moment the story changed. The front door opened just a few inches. Slow, cautious, nothing like the sharp, territorial entrances Frank was known for. A sliver of night air slipped into the room, carrying the faint scent of smoke from distant fireworks. The door paused halfway, as if he were deciding whether to come in or turn back. Then he stepped inside. His shoulders were lower than before. Not relaxed. Frank didn't relax, but lowered in a way that suggested the weight he carried had started to fold inward. He closed the door behind him with a careful click, the opposite of the slammed punctuation he used during my childhood. The room didn't move. No one rushed to greet him. No one scattered. He stood there looking at each of us in turn, his gaze skimming across Susan, pausing on Harold, then landing on Chloe. The shift in her posture was immediate, chin tucked, breath held, hands gripping the pillow. I stayed where I was, anchored in the center of the room, enough distance to choose my footing, enough presence to keep the space level. Frank cleared his throat. "We need to—" His voice cracked. It startled him. It startled all of us. He tried again. "We need to finish the conversation." I straightened. "Then finish it." His eyes flicked to me, sharp instinct like he expected challenge. But when he found calm instead of fear, his expression faltered. He looked at Chloe. "I didn't mean for things to escalate." Chloe's fingers tightened in the fabric of the pillow. Susan spoke first, voice carefully measured. "She wasn't disrespectful, Frank. She was honest." Frank's jaw tensed. "I wasn't talking to you." But the old authority wasn't landing. Not with Susan's hand still wrapped around her daughter's arm, not with Harold's stance behind the couch, not with me standing directly in his line of sight. Chloe drew in a shaky breath. "You scared me." The words slipped out before she could filter them. Frank stopped breathing for a second. His eyes widened, subtle but visible, like her fear was the last thing he expected to hear spoken aloud. "I didn't yell," he said, defensive. I stepped closer. "Fear doesn't always come from volume." He turned to me with a scowl, but I didn't break eye contact. He looked away first. Chloe's voice wavered. "You get intense, and when you're disappointed, it feels like everything I do is wrong." Frank stared at her for a long moment. A muscle twitched near his temple. The only sign that her words hit deeper than he wanted to admit. "That's not what I intended," he said finally. "But it's what happened," I replied. His head snapped toward me, but the protest never left his mouth. He swallowed hard instead. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy with things he didn't know how to say. Susan leaned in gently. "Frank, you can't parent the way you did 30 years ago. It caused damage then. It'll cause damage now." Frank bristled, but only briefly. His gaze lowered to the floor. "I was trying to make her strong." "You made her scared," Harold said, calm but firm. "There's a difference." Frank blinked, and when he lifted his head again, something in his expression had shifted, barely but real. A crack in the old armor. A moment of clarity lived inside that crack. He looked at Chloe, not over her, not through her, but at her, truly at her. "I don't want you afraid of me," he said quietly. Chloe's breath hitched. "I don't want to be." The honesty unsettled him. His shoulders dipped, almost imperceptibly. I don't know how to fix that." "You start," I said softly, "by listening." Frank exhaled, long, unsteady, like he'd been holding that breath for decades. He didn't apologize. He didn't transform. But he stopped defending the harm. And sometimes that's the first real step. Chloe's eyes glistened. Susan held her hand. Harold let out a breath he'd been holding since the argument began. The clock ticked in the corner, steady and soft. For the first time all night, Frank didn't fill the silence. He let it exist. He let us exist. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like, or next week, or next Christmas. But in that fragile, unfinished moment, I knew one thing. The cycle had finally been interrupted. Frank didn't move from the doorway. He stood there like a man suddenly aware of his own size, unsure where to put it. The room had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, and he seemed to feel it too. Not powerlessness, not defeat, just the unfamiliar sensation of not being the center gravity anymore. He cleared his throat again, softer this time. "Janet, I didn't realize you still held on to all that." I didn't look away. I didn't hold on to it, it just didn't leave. He blinked slowly as if the idea unsettled him. I thought I was preparing you. Preparation doesn't come from fear, I said. Fear only builds silence. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands fidgeted at his sides, restless in a way I hadn't seen since childhood, when his father would correct him in front of relatives. I recognized the gesture instantly. Generational shadows have their own shape. Harold stepped back toward the fireplace, giving us room without withdrawing support. Susan stayed beside Chloe, but her eyes were fixed on Frank with a mixture of exhaustion and long-delayed understanding. Frank finally spoke again. You made me look like I abandoned you. You didn't abandon me, I said. You controlled me. He flinched, not dramatically, but enough. I didn't think it was control. That's the problem, I replied. A quiet thud came from the kitchen, someone dropping a spoon into the sink, a reminder that life in the rest of the house was moving normally while ours shifted underfoot. Chloe's voice trembled. Grandpa, you scare people even when you don't mean to. Frank turned to her, startled. I scare you? She nodded, tiny but certain. Sometimes. He stared at her as though trying to fit her words into a version of himself he understood. I don't want that, he managed. You created it, I said gently. He exhaled, and the sound carried years of denial dissolving into something far more human. His shoulders sagged, not dramatically, but naturally, like a man suddenly aware of the weight he'd been carrying. Then, unsteady, hesitant, he sank into the armchair across from us, not towering, not pacing, not commanding, just sitting. The room took a breath with him. Chloe tucked her hands between her knees. I'm not asking you to be perfect, she said. I just want to feel safe. Frank's eyes softened, barely visible. But something in him cracked again, this time inward. Safe, he repeated, like the word tasted unfamiliar. Susan added quietly, You don't have to speak like a drill sergeant to be respected. Harold nodded. You can lead without scaring people. Frank ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he rarely allowed himself. I didn't know I was doing that. You didn't know, I said, because no one could tell you. He met my eyes. His voice dropped. You were too afraid. I was, I said, but I'm not anymore. He swallowed, and the movement was visible in his throat. I'm not sure I know how to talk without sounding harsh. You'll learn, I said. If you want to. He didn't answer right away, but he didn't deny it, and that alone told me everything I needed to know. The movie flickered softly in the background, casting shifting colors across the room. Outside, someone set off another firework, soft, distant, almost gentle. Frank looked toward the sound, then back at us. I'll try, he said quietly. The words weren't loud. They weren't triumphant. They weren't even polished, but they were real. And sometimes, real is enough to begin. Frank stayed in that armchair longer than I expected. Not defensive, not brooding, just quiet, like someone sifting through memories they'd never examined under honest light. The rest of us didn't rush him. Silence, for once, didn't feel dangerous. It felt necessary. Chloe was the first to shift. She lowered her feet to the floor and sat up straighter, watching him with the cautious curiosity of someone seeing a familiar figure in an unfamiliar pose. Grandpa, she said gently. You don't have to fix everything tonight. Frank's eyes lifted. I don't know where to start. By listening, I reminded him. He nodded once, slow, deliberate. Not agreement, exactly. More like acceptance that the old ways weren't welcome here. Susan stood and walked toward the kitchen, returning a moment later with a glass of water. She placed it on the coffee table near him without a word, an old gesture, a quiet one. He stared at it for a moment before murmuring, almost to himself, "Thank you." She froze, not because the words were rare, but because he said them without expectation or irritation attached. Just, thanks. Chloe folded her hands. Grandpa, I'm not trying to rebel. I just want to breathe. Frank's jaw worked, but he didn't interrupt her this time. Harold moved to the edge of the dining room, leaning on the doorway, not to supervise, but to witness. He wasn't guarding against Frank. He was creating a boundary around Chloe with his presence alone. Frank rubbed the back of his neck. When I was your age, he said slowly, my father expected perfection. He didn't say it outright. He just made sure I knew. A ghost flickered in his stare. One I'd met before. One he'd never named. Chloe's voice softened. Did you feel scared too? He exhaled through his nose. Sometimes. Her eyes widened slightly, not expecting honesty from him. When I pushed you, Frank continued, I thought I was protecting you from that weight, making you strong enough so no one could make you feel small. But you made us feel small, I said, not unkindly. He closed his eyes briefly. I know. It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. I thought, he said quietly, that if I kept you on track, you'd thank me one day. I stepped closer. I didn't need a commander. I needed a parent. His gaze drifted toward the hallway, toward the years he couldn't undo, the ones that shaped me, the ones that were starting to shape Chloe. He swallowed hard. I didn't know how to be anything else. Chloe leaned forward. You can learn, if you want to. Frank stared at her as if the idea felt impossible, and yet within reach. Harold spoke for the first time in several minutes. Frank, no one here wants you out of their life. They just want you in it differently. Frank's lips pressed together, absorbing every word without the immediate impulse to defend himself. That alone was a shift. The clock ticked softly. A firework shimmered outside, coloring the curtains in faint silver. Finally, Frank said, I don't want to lose my family. You won't, I told him, but the version of you who controlled everything, that part has to go. Frank didn't argue. He didn't storm out. He didn't push back. He just nodded, a small, stunned gesture of surrender and possibility. And I felt something inside me loosen, not forgiveness, not closure, but relief that the legacy was no longer moving forward untouched. Chloe wiped at her eyes. Can we all try again? Frank's answer wasn't perfect. It wasn't eloquent, but it was real. I'll try, he said. I can do that. In the quiet that followed, something warm, not reconciliation, but hope, settled into the room, fragile as a match flame, but present. The room softened after Frank's words, still tense around the edges, still holding its history but no longer bracing for the next blow. Chloe leaned back into the sofa cushion, shoulders lowering inch by inch. Susan brushed a hand over her daughter's hair, not to soothe her, but to anchor her. Harold let out a breath he'd been holding so long, his chest visibly eased. Frank remained in the armchair, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like the truth had cracked open somewhere beneath his feet. He didn't move, didn't posture, didn't rebuild the wall he usually hid behind. He just sat there in the quiet. For the first time, he wasn't the loudest presence in the room. I took a slow step toward him, not to confront, not to comfort, but to stand where I needed to stand. Trying matters, I said, but trying also means hearing things that will hurt. He looked up at me, cautious, wary. Like what? I held his gaze. Like the fact that I paid for college because being free was worth more than your approval. The words landed, quietly, directly, without cruelty. Frank's mouth tightened, not in anger, more like someone finally absorbing a consequence decades overdue. I thought you were ungrateful, he said softly. I was surviving, I answered. The silence that followed wasn't sharp this time. It was heavy, human. Chloe's voice slipped in, gentle but unexpectedly strong. Grandpa, You can't control people into becoming who you want. A faint tremor crossed Frank's jaw. I didn't realize I was doing that to you. I didn't either, she admitted. Not until tonight. Susan squeezed her daughter's hand. Awareness is the first step. Harold nodded, arms crossed, not defensive, just present. And no one here expects perfection. Frank rubbed his palms together. I don't know if I'm built for this gentler way of doing things. You weren't raised with it, I said, but Chloe deserves it, and so did I. He winced, not from offense, but recognition. Then quietly he said, I don't want her to resent me when she's your age. Chloe's breath hitched. I don't want to either. He looked at her, really looked, eyes softening in a way I hadn't seen since childhood, back when he'd carry me to the car after I fell asleep at family gatherings, long before control replaced tenderness. You're not my enemy, he said to her. I don't want to be yours. Her lip quivered. Then don't make me feel small. The words struck him visibly, like someone had peeled back a layer he didn't know existed. I'll work on it, he said, voice almost a whisper. I promise nothing overnight, but I'll work on it. She nodded, wiping at her cheeks. I watched the exchange with a strange ache, one part grief for what I never received, one part hope that she might. Then Frank turned to me. Janet, I can't change what happened with you. I know, I said, but he hesitated. If I can do better with her, maybe that counts for something. I held his gaze, the years between us stretching and folding all at once. It does. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but truth. He nodded once, slow, humbled. The air in the room shifted like a window had opened somewhere unseen. Outside, the last fireworks of the night crackled faintly, far beyond the yard. A soft glow filtered through the curtains, catching dust in the air like snowfall. Chloe whispered, Can we all sit together for a minute, just to breathe? None of us said no. We arranged ourselves slowly, Susan beside Chloe, Harold pulling a chair closer, Frank staying in his armchair but leaning in, not out. I sat on the ottoman, facing all of them, the closest we had been to a circle in years. There were no speeches, no instructions, no demands, just breath, just presence, just the quiet hum of a family trying, really trying, to shift the weight of its own legacy. And for the first time, the silence felt like possibility. We stayed in that loose circle for a long while, longer than anyone expected. No one spoke, no one rushed to fill the space. It was the kind of silence families usually avoid, the kind that reveals things instead of hiding them. But tonight, it felt like the only honest language any of us had left. Chloe's breathing steadied first, then Susan's hand stopped trembling. Harold leaned back in his chair, the tension easing from his shoulders. And Frank. He sat still, elbows resting on his thighs, fingers interlaced the way they had been earlier, but without the rigidness, without the anger. He looked older, not weak, just human. I watched him quietly. The lines around his eyes looked deeper than I remembered. The stubbornness in his posture had softened. He seemed like a man facing a reflection he couldn't avoid. Finally, he spoke. Janet. His voice was low, not sharp, not commanding, simply present. I lifted my gaze. Yes? You said earlier that being free mattered more than my approval. He paused. I didn't understand that. I know, I said gently. I do now. A beat. I don't want her, he nodded toward Chloe, to feel like my approval is a condition. Chloe swallowed hard. I don't want that either. He looked at her. Tell me when I'm doing it. Don't wait until it builds up like this. She nodded slowly. Okay. His voice wavered. I didn't know I was turning into him. Susan blinked. Into who? Frank looked down, jaw tight. My father. A quiet ripple moved through the room. I had waited my entire youth for him to say those words, not to blame his father, not to excuse himself, but to recognize the shape of the harm. He continued, voice uneven. He pushed me. Hard. I thought I was tough because of it. He shook his head. Turns out I was just scared. The admission knocked the air from my chest, not because it hurt, but because it landed somewhere deeper than I expected. A truth spoken too late, but spoken nonetheless. Chloe leaned forward. You don't have to keep being scared. He let out a breath, shaky but real. Neither do you. No one cried. No one collapsed into hugs. That wasn't who we were. But something tender threaded through the room, thin, fragile, new. Harold cleared his throat. Frank, if you ever want help navigating this, you don't have to do it alone. Frank almost smiled. You offering therapy? Just support, Harold replied. For her, for all of us. Frank nodded once. I appreciate that. The clock ticked. The dishwasher hummed. The fireworks outside fizzled into nothing. Then Chloe looked at me. Aunt Janet, did it hurt hearing him say all that? I took a breath. Yes. Does it help? She asked softly. I thought about it. The years I spent shrinking. The nights I chose silence over peace. The mornings I swallowed fear like medicine. It helps, I said, but it doesn't erase anything. Frank looked away, shame flickering across his face, brief and raw. Chloe reached toward me, her fingers brushing mine. But maybe it's a start? I squeezed her hand. It is. The house felt different now, not healed, not mended, but shifted, tilted in the right direction for the first time in decades. A change of generations, a change of patterns, a change of breath. Frank leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes for a moment, not to shut us out, but to stay. And staying. That was new. The house had grown noticeably quieter. The post-firework adrenaline was gone, leaving only the soft thrum of a dishwasher, the ticking of the hallway clock, and the lingering warmth of bodies who had been through something heavy together. The July night pressed gently against the windows. Everything felt slower, softer, bare. Frank rubbed his palms together, a restless habit but no longer charged with the edge that used to make my stomach twist. Just unsure, vulnerable. In a way I wasn't sure I had ever seen him. I don't know what to do next, he admitted. The truth in that sentence surprised all of us. You don't have to know, I said. You just have to stop pretending you already do. He nodded once, absorbing that. Chloe curled her feet under her, her voice small. Grandpa. He turned toward her immediately, too quickly, almost startled. Yes? You don't have to talk to me like I'm always disappointing you. A shadow flickered in his expression. Not anger, something closer to regret. I didn't realize I was doing that. But you were, she whispered. He swallowed. I know that now. Another shift, small but noticeable. Susan offered him a faint, careful smile, one built on decades of working around him, but sincere nonetheless. Awareness is more than we've ever had from you. Frank didn't snap back, didn't roll his eyes, didn't defend himself. He just breathed, slow, unsteady. I'm trying, he said. I see that, I replied. He looked down. I didn't mean to make you pay for college alone. I thought attaching expectations would make you stronger. It made me afraid of you, I said. He closed his eyes briefly, the weight of that sentence landing deep. I didn't know. I couldn't tell you, I added. You didn't leave room for honesty. He nodded again, smaller this time, an inward motion, like cataloging the truth instead of dodging it. Harold leaned against the doorway. Nobody's expecting miracles, Frank. Just change. Frank exhaled through his nose. An old habit, but the sound lacked the usual irritation. I'm too old to start over. No, I said quietly. You're just old enough to do better. He actually smiled, faint, worn, but real. Spoken like someone who grew up despite me. I grew up, I said, because of what I had to walk away from. His smile faded at that, replaced by something that almost looked like grief. Chloe watched him, her eyes steady. You don't have to be the grandpa people avoid. He blinked, hard. I didn't know I was, he whispered. That's the point, I said. The room went still again, not suffocating, not harsh, just still in a way that felt like we were collectively letting something settle. Frank finally leaned back in the armchair, shoulders sinking in surrender more than exhaustion. I don't want to lose any of you. You won't, Susan said. As long as you meet us halfway, Harold added. Frank looked at me last. Can you forgive me? The question hit like warm water against a cold bruise, tender, stinging, unexpected. I took a slow breath. Not tonight. His face fell, not offended, not angry, just accepting. But, I continued, I can begin. He lifted his gaze, eyes raw. And beginnings, I said softly, are worth something. Chloe's breath shook. Susan's eyes glistened. Even Harold pushed his hands into his pockets, overwhelmed by the softness of the moment. We didn't hug. We didn't cry in a dramatic pile. That wasn't our family, but we stayed in the same room, close, breathing, together. And that alone was a kind of healing. The night stretched deeper, settling into that quiet hour when the world feels thinner and every emotion feels a little more honest. The movie on the TV had long ended. The screen now glowed faintly with a paused menu. No one bothered to turn it off. We sat together in that half-light, all of us exhausted in different ways, but none of us leaving. Frank shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago, not in body but in presence. The command he used to carry like armor had faded, leaving something rawer behind. I didn't realize, he said suddenly, that my voice could hurt even when I wasn't shouting. Chloe swallowed. It does. He nodded. I hear you. It was the simplest sentence, but from him, it was monumental. Susan rested her hand on her daughter's knee. You can change how you speak to her. And to Janet. Frank looked at me, really looked, and his voice dropped. I don't know how to talk to you without sounding hard. Then speak slowly, I said, and ask instead of assuming. He took that in, the way a man takes in instructions he's afraid to misinterpret. Harold rubbed his temples. We're all doing a lot tonight, maybe more than we expected. I nodded. Confrontation isn't the enemy. Avoidance is. Frank's gaze flicked toward the window, where faint smoke trails from fireworks still curled into the dark sky. You always were better with words than me. I raised an eyebrow. That's because you never let me use them. His face tightened with guilt. Real guilt, not the defensive kind. I know. Chloe leaned forward. Grandpa? He turned to her gently. Yes? If you want us to be close, you can't scare me into listening. His shoulders sagged. I don't want to scare you. Then don't, she whispered. The room held its breath. Frank's voice came out rough, but steady. I'll try. You have my word. It wasn't a grand promise. It wasn't enough to erase the years, but it was the kind of promise that carried weight, because he didn't offer it lightly. Susan rubbed her hands together. It might help to set boundaries. Frank stiffened instinctively, but didn't lash out. What kind? Like, she said carefully, no raising your voice, no belittling, no comments that make her feel small. And, Chloe added, maybe ask how I'm doing instead of assuming the worst. He nodded, slower this time, the movement thoughtful. I can do that. I watched him. I didn't trust the words yet, but I trusted the shift. That mattered more. Frank, I said, trying isn't weakness. His eyes met mine. It feels like it. It only feels like weakness, I said, because strength has always meant control to you. His face softened in a way I had never seen. "You're right." Chloe's posture eased. Just a little, but enough. Harold checked his watch. "It's late. Should we all head out soon?" Frank shook his head, not commanding, but earnest. "Not yet. I want to make sure we don't end this night angry." The room fell still. Susan studied him, cautious but hopeful. "That's new. It's honest," he replied. A long, fragile silence followed, and then Chloe whispered, "Thank you." Frank's eyes glistened, not enough for tears, but enough to say he felt the weight of her gratitude. He straightened, inhaling deeply. "I'm learning." I smiled, small, steady. "So are we." Outside, another distant firework popped, faint enough to sound like a sigh. The house settled into the softness of a family finally facing the truth without flinching. No shouting, no storming out, no running, just staying, together, trying. It wasn't closure, but closure wasn't the goal. The goal was change, and for the first time, change felt possible. Eventually, the night thinned even further, so late that the house no longer felt like a gathering place, but a place where something had quietly broken and quietly begun again. The glow from the TV dimmed. The hallway light flickered once before settling. The air conditioning hummed a steady, low rhythm. Nobody rushed to leave. Nobody pushed the conversation forward. We were all sitting inside a moment that none of us quite knew how to measure. Frank shifted in the armchair, fingers tapping against his knee. Not impatient, not irritated, just uneasy in a way that made him seem reachable. He cleared his throat. "Janet, yes? I don't expect forgiveness. I know. But I'd like to earn something close to it." He hesitated. "Over time, if you let me." A part of me, the part shaped by years of flinching at his footsteps, didn't know how to receive that. But the woman I had become, the one who learned to walk away from his control, understood the rarity of what he was offering. "We'll see," I said softly. He nodded, accepting the uncertainty without pushing for more. Chloe sat forward, her eyes flicking between the two of us. "Grandpa, can I say something?" Frank leaned in, bracing himself. "Go ahead. You make me nervous when you talk like everything is life or death. I want to feel like you're happy for me, not checking if I'm disappointing you." His gaze dropped. "I didn't know I sounded like that." "It feels like pressure," she whispered. He rubbed his thumb along the armrest, absorbing every word. "I'm sorry." The words were quiet but steady, not forced, not defensive, just true. Susan inhaled sharply, processing the sudden simplicity of his apology. Harold watched all of it with a slow, cautious relief spreading through his posture. Then, unexpectedly, Frank turned to me again. "And Janet, I'm sorry you had to leave to feel safe." The breath caught in my throat. Not because the apology healed anything, but because it was the one sentence I never thought I'd hear. Chloe's hand sneaked toward mine again. "Aunt Janet, I'm all right," I murmured. "I just didn't expect him to say that." Frank nodded, almost embarrassed by the honesty in his own words. "I should have said it sooner." "Yes," I said, "but saying it now matters." A long silence settled over us, not heavy, just full. Then Harold stood and stretched his back, the motion cracking with age. "We should all get some sleep." Chloe nodded, wiping the corner of her eye. "Yeah, it's late." Frank pushed himself out of the armchair. "Before everyone goes..." We waited. He took a slow breath, gaze sweeping across all of us. "I want to do better, not just tonight, not just because you're upset, but because I saw something in myself I didn't like." His voice shook, a tremor I'd never heard from him. "I don't want the rest of my years to look like the first half of them." Chloe let out a breath that broke slightly at the edges. "That means a lot." Frank turned to her. I'll need your patience. And you'll have it, she said, if you give me space to be honest. He nodded. Deal. Susan pressed her hand to her heart. Frank, I haven't heard you talk like this since we were young. Maybe I forgot how, he admitted, or maybe I never knew. Harold clapped a hand gently on Frank's shoulder, not congratulating, not lecturing, just offering solidarity. This is a good start. Frank didn't resist the gesture. That alone was change. I looked at him. This man who had shaped so much of my fear, now standing in front of me, stripped of everything he used to wield. You don't have to become a different person, I said. Just a kinder one. He nodded, eyes softer. I can try. That was the moment something inside me, something long clenched, finally loosened. Not healed, not erased, but loosened. A beginning I never thought we'd reach. The night had fallen into that deep, fragile stillness that only comes when the house has said everything it needed to say. We all drifted toward the front hallway, slow and quiet, as though any sudden movement might undo what had shifted between us. Shoes scraped softly against the tile. A jacket sleeve brushed the wall. The kind of small sounds that feel louder after a long, emotional unraveling. Chloe slipped her arms around me in a loose, tired hug. Thank you for standing up for me, she whispered. I didn't stand up for you, I murmured. I stood with you. She held on for a second longer, then let go. Wiping under her eye with the back of her hand, Susan gently guided her toward the door, her hand warm on her daughter's shoulder. Harold reached for the doorknob but paused, giving Frank one last look. You did something good tonight, Frank exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the floor. I hope I didn't do it too late. Late, Harold said, is still better than never. They shook hands, quiet, steady. Then Harold stepped out into the humid July night. Susan followed, offering Frank a soft nod. Chloe climbed into the car, glancing back through the window with a tentative smile. I stayed behind. Frank stood by the edge of the living room, his hand pressed to the back of the armchair he'd spent the night unraveling in. His shoulders were looser. His voice wasn't sharp. And something in his posture, something small but unmistakable, looked like humility. Janet, he said. Yes? I know you don't owe me anything, not forgiveness, not kindness, not even conversation. I didn't respond. Not yet. He continued, voice wavering at the edges. But thank you for saying the truth out loud. I crossed my arms gently, not defensive, just grounding myself. Someone had to. He nodded. I know. A soft creak came from the kitchen as the dishwasher switched cycles. The light above us buzzed once before settling. The house felt older than it had at the start of the night, as if it had finally exhaled. Frank took a small step toward me. I'm not proud of the father I was. I'm not asking you to be, I said. I'm asking you to be better now. He held my gaze. I want that. For all of us. The sincerity in his voice surprised me. Not because I didn't think he could feel it, but because he had never let it show. I don't hate you, I said quietly. He blinked. I thought you might. No, I said, but I stopped needing your approval a long time ago. Something in him sank at that, something that had been propped up by control for years, and for once, instead of bristling, he simply let it fall. That's fair, he whispered. I reached for the doorknob, the metal cool beneath my hand. Good night, Frank. He didn't stop me. He didn't argue. He didn't throw one last comment into the air. He just nodded, a faint, humbled gesture. Good night, Janet. I stepped outside, the warm night folding around me like a relief I hadn't realized I was holding out for. The fireworks were gone. The sky was quiet. And for the first time, the silence didn't scare me. It felt earned. I closed the door behind me and let out a breath I'd been holding for years. A breath that didn't tremble. A breath that didn't brace for the next explosion. Just a breath. And in that small, steady moment, I realized something simple. Some people don't change because you call them out. They change because they finally hear themselves. And after all these years, he finally did. If this story echoed anything in your family, you can share it below.